Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the webinar series at the Ball State University Center for Professional Selling. As before, we have another interesting guest speaker, and the guest speaker today is James Cacus, who is the Director of Solutions Engineering from a company called Showpad. Now, for some of you who are wondering what Showpad does, it's a company which is headquartered in Belgium, but has a very, very strong presence in the United States as well, in North America. It is a company that has actually prided itself on being a sales enablement organization, and how they go about trying to help sales organizations be successful is what Showpad is all about. But before we get into all what Showpad does, I just want to thank James for taking time off his busy schedule to talk to us about it. So James, thank you once again.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Really excited to talk about Showpad today and sales enablement.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping that when we talk about this, you're also going to be enlightening us about the concept of sales enablement. Right? Now, I want to begin with something. So essentially, there seems to be a lot of buzz about sales enablement. Again, for people active in social media, at least, there seems to be a lot of talk about sales enablement. And what is this sales enablement all about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I want to start with a quote from Serious Decisions. This is something that I use as my core and when I explain sales enablement. But sales enablement's goal is to ensure that every seller has the required knowledge, skills, process, and behaviors to optimize every interaction with buyers, right? So that's a pretty complicated sentence, but I think what we're learning and what we're seeing is that it encompasses a lot of items, right? Whether it's making sure that you have context to your content, maybe it's making sure that you're trained appropriately, you are going into meetings and using your time effectively, or maybe have the tools to get your job done, right? Sales enablement has, in my experience, right, about 3.5, 4 years in this field, has really grown and changed a lot over the last couple of years.
Indeed. I think it's very interesting. You mentioned one of the things which was what? Context to the content.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things to say.
Yeah, but it's also the other way around too, right? It's content to the context, but also context to the content, because at the end of the day, you do not know whom you're going to be talking to as a salesperson. So I think you need a little bit of both. That is, I need to know my context, but I should also know my content, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think that's the kind of the root cause of where Showpad started in general, is that you need to be out in the field and you're going to get curveballs. Questions are going to come out in any selling situation, and you might not always be prepared. So all you can ask for is that your organization prepares you as much as possible to be able to speak about, content line A or product line B or the industry in general, right? It's really it's a chicken and the egg type scenario, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what it is for me. Is one of the things that struck me a lot, and that's something that again we read a lot, and they talk about the fact that there's work by Gartner that says that around 6.8 people in the customer's decision-making unit, and is that also one of the reasons why we see an increased interest in sales enablement? Because having this kind of conversations, and it could be that it's 6.8 with one customer, but if I'm a sales rep and I have 4 different customers on a single day, for example, then I'm looking at, okay, I'm not saying all the time you're going to have 6 people there, but you're going to talk about multiple conversations. You need to keep track of it. You also need to make sure that you need to have that right kind of content. What are your thoughts on that one?
No, I think you're exactly right. And what we see, and depending on different industries, is that sometimes there's double that in terms of a buying cycle, right? Depending on what you're trying to sell.
Indeed.
So it is a lot. And I think what we've really entered into is the day of the empowered buyer, of the informed buyer, right? People are doing their homework. They're now more knowledgeable when you go into a selling situation. With the growth and expansion of the internet, people can go and do their own research. I also think that because of a lot of B2C companies like Amazon and Netflix have streamlined and made things so easy for us, the expectations in the sales process are actually much higher as well too.
Yeah.
And there's an increased competition, right? So you just have to be on it at all times, and you have to be aware and knowledgeable in any given situation.
You mentioned something that was pretty interesting for me, and that's something that I've not thought about, is you mentioned the fact that it's to help prepare your salespeople, right? And I'm assuming that, yes, of course, your established salespeople really, yeah, they can definitely use help, but assuming that they're open-minded to that, we'll get to that a little bit later on. But what interested me was the fact that when I was listening to people talk about sales enablement, they talk about employee onboarding as well as a critical part of sales enablement. Why do you think that is critical? Should that be part of sales enablement at all?
Yeah, I do think, and I think, personally, I think, and Showpad as an organization has really watched this closely. And I think when you talk about enablement, it can't just be when you're 90 days or 6 months or 1 year into the job. It does start on day one, right? It does start in making sure that you're knowledgeable about the company, knowledgeable about your team, knowledgeable about where you came from, right? And why sales enablement really starts on the ground is that you need that foundation and those building blocks to be successful and set up for ongoing success, right? Because when you first join an organization, as you can imagine, I like to think of it sometimes drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot of information that comes in. You're not always digesting it very well. And you need to be, again, foundational building blocks, because if you don't get your foundation early on, it's going to take you longer to actually start contributing to the organization or to find where you go. So in my opinion, it really does start early on and with the seller engagement or the employee engagement when they join the organization. That will allow them to really make an impact a lot quicker.
Yeah. So one of the things which is, I always go back to sales enablement, and I'm sure there's a temptation for many people to think of sales enablement as just being a technology or a tool, right? And they could take a look at a company such as yours, Showpad, as a tool. And what would your kind of not advice, but what would be your take on this?
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that's come up in a number of books, right? Like, can technology lead the change process? And in my opinion, it's only one component, right? It is a component of the process. There's a lot of change management. There's a lot of education that goes on around this. And I think that tools or platforms, while they might solve a lot of problems, they don't solve all of the problems, right? So it is a much bigger encompassing component. And again, with tools, you might have a sales enablement tool that does 1/8 of your job function, and then you have another one that does 2/3 of your job function. So I think technology plays a major component, especially maybe in things like time to value. However, it can't be deemed as like, this is the almighty that will get us where we need to go, right? There's still a lot that needs to come with that. And I think that's why this space is newer, growing, and exciting, is because there's just so much green grass and so much uncharted territory that companies like Showpad and others are paving the way in this space.
Okay. So you mentioned there's a lot of things about sales enablement, right? You talked about what the students around me tell me stuff. So what is this stuff about sales enablement? So what are the different parts about sales enablement over and beyond the tool? So the building blocks, if I may say, of sales enablement.
I think for me, again, it all starts, I've already said this once, is like context to the content, right? Yeah. It just, and what that really means, if you take a step back, it's just understanding what you're speaking to or what you're trying to do, right? Whether that is being out in the field and trying to sell a product, whether that is navigating something within your internal organization on how to get something done, you just need to have a firm base and understanding of how the process works, right? How do we find efficiencies in our rules? How do we find efficiencies in our jobs and make things streamlined so that we can be more successful? I think today there's just a lot of noise that happens, right, everywhere, whether that's personal, that's not. I think I read a statistic that there's over 300 plus notifications that people get on their phones and computers per day, right? So there's just a lot of noise in general. So I think what, again, sales enablement means is just making sure you have what you need, the information that you need to make sure that you are moving at a constant pace that's forward.
So it's interesting when you talk about this, and you began a little bit earlier talking about the fact that it's about the buying experience, right? So now, to what extent the processes that you talked about, are the processes internal to my sales organization? Do I want to increase my sales efficiency, or should it be something bigger than that? Is that something where I need to begin with, hey, let's talk about the buyer experience. What is it that the buyer needs to experience? And then align our processes? Or is it the fact that, okay, you know what, that's somebody else's business. my job in sales enablement is just align the sales process?
I love this question. I really love this question. I think this is something that myself and my team, we continue to talk about on a bi-weekly basis, right? We call it the buyer journey.
Yeah.
And we have a part 2, part 3, part 4, and we talk about this. In my opinion, again, we are moving at a constant pace. We meaning society, right? B2B is changing. B2C is changing. B2B companies are now starting to act like B2C companies.
Yeah.
And again, that is evolving. So what works for me, and I might buy textiles in industry, but you might buy widgets in another industry, is completely different.
Yeah.
And I think that is why we need to start being a little bit more nimble in changing in our process, right? I think that any organization to move forward, you have to have a process in place, right? You have to have a sales methodology, a sales process of your baseline knowledge. You know, I think companies that sell a singular product into a singular industry have an easier job at that versus a company that sells multiple products into multiple industries, right? You have to be able to adapt. What I do, and for my team, is I call that my toolbox. We have a solutions engineering toolbox, which is these are the stage of the sales cycle. This is what you would expect to happen. This is where you can go into your toolbox and grab different things to do and to use in that sales cycle. So I do think that as an organization, you need to have rigor and you need to be able to have some sort of process to move forward. However, you have to have the ability to understand when you need to pivot and go against what we believe is right in terms of our process and understand the customer, right? You know, just for instance, I'm in sales. You know, we have seen situations where we believe we have a process on how we do things. Customer wasn't interested in going with our process and decided not to purchase anything at this time, right? And so I think that's where this evolution and, again, the advancement of the seller is really changing. And we're moving from this traditional way of sales to this modern day of sales. And there's still some organizations, some industries that are on the bleeding edge and the cutting edge, and there's still some that are a little bit behind, right? So you have to have fluidity, in my opinion.
But that's interesting. So I'm going to paraphrase what I heard from James. So essentially what I heard is that you need to have a very clear customer strategy. You need to know what the buying experience should be. And then the next thing is, if I do that, I should also have a sales process to map into that buying, because if I don't do that, it could be that I don't align exactly to what the customers want. I'm not able to answer their needs, and that could lead to a non-sale, right? But you also said something which I think is people grossly underestimate, is this concept of change, right? So you said pivot. So pivot on paper, or as the way James says it, is a lot easier than actually getting salespeople who think they know what the customers want and what is right for the customer. So to what extent is change management something that is key to the success of any kind of sales enablement initiative?
Yeah, let's start with change in general, right? Change is hard in general. No matter what you're doing, whether it's your personal life, your professional life, going through some sort of change takes time and it takes effort, right? And when you're looking at sales enablement in general, I think change management is actually one of the most important building blocks of that foundation that grows. The reason being is that if I'm a seller, right, and I've been selling for 2 decades, maybe even 3 decades, and I've been selling similar products to similar people, and I've been doing it my way for a long time, right? Once I've been in an organization for a while, that myself replicates the tribal knowledge, right? We don't make data-driven decisions. We start making tribal knowledge decisions. And so when, you know, a new executive comes in or leadership says, we're going to change and bring in this type of platform or software to help us in your day-to-day, that requires a lot of work.
Yeah.
And that actually requires, again, a massive switch in terms of what I have been doing every day for 2 or 3 decades, or even 1 decade, right? Or 1 year, right? It changes everything, right? So it has to be done very efficiently with a strong methodology about how it works, right? And in my opinion, again, I always preface with my opinion, is that we have to find an inherent benefit for the salespeople. Like for Showpad, for instance, if I'm a seller, why should I care? That's one of the things I ask people all the time in the sales process. talk to me like why I should care. Why should a salesperson care about this? And instituting this and giving them a reason why it matters to them and why it makes their job easier and will help them in their role is the start, right? And then it's a bit of a gradual process. I always like to look at things as a crawl, walk, run. You can't rip the Band-Aid from day one and say, here it is, go wild and expect to have success, right? You have to have clear defined metrics. You have to have a clear path and a plan for enabling these people and getting them ramped over a period of time. We are fortunate, and again, from my personal situation, seeing at Showpad, we have a lot of retention, a massive amount of retention. In net retention, we're 130%. So we're adding more licenses than we are losing customers at any given time. And that's because we focus on the inherent benefit for the salespeople as to why they would want a platform like this. And then we really focus on getting their feedback throughout that process, right? So change management is critical because if you don't roll something out right in the beginning, it will fail. It will fail, and it's hard, whether that's a methodology, a strategy, a technology.
So I want to kind of close this up with the summary of what James said. So this is my take on it. So this is the more layman's person's take on it. Now the expert James is have a strategy where the customer is the focus of the strategy. Align your processes in line with what the strategy is, but do not be afraid to pivot if needed. And that's where change management comes in. So the three essential components of that. Great. Now, James, one of the things we've talked about is what are the building blocks of sales enablement, right? So now tell me, what are some of the key success factors? So what drives sales enablement projects to be successful? When I mean project, it could also be a strategy as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question. And I think that does somewhat depend on what we're looking to introduce, right? So again, I'll take this from the lens of Showpad in my Showpad lens. So for Showpad, we are a technology that sells into sales and marketing, sales enablement, and IT, right? So you automatically have about 4 stakeholders that are going to be in the buying decision no matter what, right? And for us, we have to really identify what is going to be a success factor for each of those departments that, again, makes their job easier, right? And so we have what we would determine as predetermined, right? But as we talked about previously, the other organization might have a major initiative or a KPI or a vision that they're going toward, right? And so, for instance, in a Showpad example for marketing, a lot of times their sellers are using things that are off-brand or out of date, or they lost control of content. So Showpad puts that in a single repository for them. Right? For our sellers can't find content. Things are off-brand. There's a million different versions, and they don't have what they need at their fingertips. So what we want to do is be able to streamline all of that so they always know where to go. They can always find what they need, whether it's online, offline, computer, tablet, phone, right? That's a success there. When it comes to enablement, they want to make sure that their people are on message and they are trained effectively, right? So we want to make sure that they are being coached and there's that opportunity to learn. And then with the IT organization, they want to make sure that it's safe and it's controllable, right? Single sign-on, mobile device management, analytics components. They want to make sure that they have all of that information. So we need to speak to those values there. So, again, that's just a Showpad example. But what I'm trying to say overall is that there are always going to be a lot of stakeholders. Metrics and success will change depending on what you're trying to introduce. Again, methodology, strategy, technology. But you really have to get buy-in across everyone for this thing to move forward and for your organization to move forward without kind of getting tripped up on itself.
Let me ask you a tricky question. Now, this comes from a book that I read recently called The Challenger Customer. It is a follow-up to the best-selling book, The Challenger Sale, The Challenger Customer, where they kind of mention the fact that, yes, we need to make sure that every stakeholder, you give the example of Showpad, but I'm assuming that if it's any other person listening to this, they will have their own set of stakeholders in the customer's organization that they need to talk to, right? Now, yes, we can talk about tailoring our message to point, but sometimes we tailor it so much that we miss the bigger picture. So to what extent should you draw the line? And this is for Showpad relevant as it is for anybody else, where you draw the line between customizing it per profile, but still keeping a higher level kind of idea about what the organization that recruits these 4 people wants to achieve?
Yeah, this is a great question. So thanks for the curveball question here. So I think you have to look at it in terms of layers, right?
Yeah.
You have to look at it at the individual motivation level. Sometimes in sales, you wonder, what is a lever that you could pull that's going to get somebody paid or get them their bonus, right?
Yeah.
What are they paid on in their motivations? Are they motivated to get a promotion, or are they motivated to, move within the company? So you look at the individual level motivations, and then from a step up, you also look at the organizational level motives, right? The CRO, the CMO,
Exactly.
right? And then you look at the top level. What is the CEO? What is the board saying, right? And I think, what I've seen a lot in the last couple of years is digital transformation. So many companies from the top level said, this is our digital transformation strategy and goal. And then it cascades down, right? And so you're right. For Showpad, for any platform, any product, you have to figure out how you kind of fit in that top level message and how it comes down, because in reality, the individuals at the top of the company are making the decisions, right? What I learned from my career too is, like, sometimes you call that your North Star. You're putting your North Star out there, and you need to figure out how to get there. You might not know how initially, right? But that's what our goal is, to try to align with that and cascade down.
Yeah. So absolutely. And I think that's something that we should not forget, is the fact that, and I think there's a trick, not for sales enablement itself, but for salespeople, is yes, you need to customize your message, but don't also forget the bigger picture, because what you're going to happen is, I think a lot of times decisions are put off because every individual feels that their needs are met, but wait a minute, my organization is not going to benefit. So the IT person might say, yes, I'm going to keep this with ease of use for my salespeople or my marketing people, but hey, look at the budget that I'll need to get those licenses. And essentially, everything, you may tick all the boxes except that one part, which has nothing to do with the user who has to use it, but actually has got to do with corporate goals. So,
exactly.
And is that something that's, for example, that Showpad, I know that Showpad is just still a tool, but is that something that you insist when you talk to your customers, that in order for them to be successful in implementing Showpad or any sales enablement, that the content should be at both at a very high corporate level as well as at the individual level?
Yeah, and I would even take that a step back, right? Before we even get totally engaged, right? This isn't a transactional market yet, right? You're still doing some education. You're still doing some training as you are doing selling, right?
Yeah.
So even for us, something like a joint execution plan, because you might be selling a software or technology to someone, but we make a joke that if you're selling to the janitor who doesn't have any buying power, that's not going to get anywhere, right? And that's an example that someone who's been working in this industry for 30 or 40 years has brought up, right? Yeah. And so I think that's what it all has to start with, a project, right? And it all has to start with a budget toward a project in any selling situation. Again, if you don't have a high inbound transactional sell, there is education that has to come out there, right? And you know that through marketing automation, lead generation, right? But that's kind of the building blocks of where it stands from our perspective, right?
Indeed. Let me then bring me to another point, which is one of my favorites again, which is the concept of, you talked about 4 stakeholders that sales, Showpad has to do. Again, as I said, yes, we give the example of a Showpad sales experience, but it could be true for any sales organization that has to deal with 4 different silos in the customer's organization, right? Now, to what extent do you think that any sales enablement initiative is likely to fail because of very silo-oriented thinking in the organization that is trying to enable its sales force? What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's actually something that we see all the time, right? You tend to see companies explore routes like this and end in no decision because they're not necessarily going with a different competitor product. It's that their organization is not aligned, right? This is still somewhat new. This is still a technology, a process, a strategy that hasn't been very defined. And you're right. Like, if the sales enablement component says this is mission critical for us to get our customers, or excuse me, our employees on this, but marketing doesn't have the bandwidth to support it, it might not go anywhere. Again, to go back to Showpad, this is why we have really invested in a platform, right? We made an acquisition of LearnCore. which focuses on, the learning and training, and we've rebranded that as Showpad Coach. We have our content, and then we've made some developments in voice, in voice AI, right? So the way I always say is that when a CFO or an executive is going down line by line and they need to cut some software and some technology, they might say, what does Showpad do? And if you say that Showpad only does one thing, they might say, okay, we might be able to replace that. But if I said Showpad did this, 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 and this, and we're aligned across those organizations, it's a lot stickier and usually has a lot more success, right? And so that's, again, a risk, I think, of any solution that's expanding to be a platform, is that you're not just a point solution that is used by a siloed team. And again, you don't have buy-in, all the way up your silo or to the next one. It might not go anywhere.
Indeed. And I can easily add to this the complexity of a global customer, where you have a silo within the organization, but you also have silo across geographies as well. So I think that makes it that much more harder. And one of the things which we usually, when we talk about sales enablement, and again, of course, there are going to be multiple players as well, but the biggest two silos that people mention a lot that need to work together are supposed to be marketing and sales, right? Now, in your opinion, right, who should take ownership of sales enablement? Of course, you can always say it has to be all the way to the top. We need to have somebody kind of advocating for sales enablement at the boardroom level. That's nice, but let's talk about that. Really, what happens on the field? Yeah. So, who should take ownership of sales enablement?
Yeah. So I think if you gave me the option of sales or marketing, I'm going to say sales, right? Yeah. I think at the end of the day, this is something that's for your sellers, and if you don't have top-down, buy-in from this will not succeed, right? A lot of times for sales enablement, again, marketing might be a lot of the administrators or users or components, but at the end of the day, if the sales organization is not aligned, not driving critical success, it doesn't go anywhere. I do want to bring something up that I think is, we talk about sales enablement, but I have seen, again, I've been at Showpad for 3.5 years. I've been introduced to this space for about 4.5, living in San Francisco. The growth of the role of sales enablement as a function in your organization is, to me, one of the fastest growing and rising roles that I have seen in my career, right? We've gone from sales enablement just being a term and a function to now being a role, to now being a department and a major key player in the organization. And in my opinion, that it's got to be not just sales and marketing, but enablement has a seat at the table that, talks almost as like, we talk about sales and marketing bridging the gap. The enablement team kind of bridges the gap of both, right? And we're seeing chief enablement officers for organizations as major strategic roles that have decision-making process. And I think that, to me, is the most fascinating change that's happened in all of this.
Indeed. So we have a chief executive officer and we have a chief enablement officer. James, this is very, very interesting, because what I was hoping, what I was thinking you would say, which was what me being the smart, I thought this is what James is going to say, is it is going to be marketing that has to take, but I'm glad you talked about sales, because in a lot of business to business companies that I've had a chance to work with, marketing is still seen as people who actually organize events, make websites, and that's pretty much it. And so essentially it's mostly the sales. But by you saying, so what I was hoping, or what I was thinking, was that you need sales, but you need a more operational marketing focus from the sales organization to do it. But this idea of a chief sales enablement as a department itself raises a very interesting, is how should this be staffed? Should this be staffed by people who have no idea about sales and marketing? Or should it be again staffed with people with sales, people with marketing, or the markups and the sales ops? That's what we hear more and more, sales operations and marketing. Should they be staffed together with a separate role and a separate boss?
Yeah, this is an exciting topic, right? And I think that it's all of those items that you mentioned, plus learning and development specialists, right? I think some of the most successful enablement organizations that I've seen and sold to are started from a person who is wildly successful in the field as a seller and was like, I need this to do my job, and decided to just be the one who leads that function. right?
Yeah.
And leads that function because they were an actual seller in the field and know the strengths. And then what they do is, because they know that, they bring in the marketing people, the marketing ops people, they bring in the sales ops, and learning development to create curriculums around it. And so in my opinion, it's a very well-versed, well-balanced team that understands what happens in the field. And that's the one thing too to bring up, is that I think enablement still is being defined. I mean, for instance, I've worked with people, sold with people, that their definition of sales enablement is drastically different than
Absolutely.
I operate as
No,
sales enablement.
indeed.
Right? And there's still no wrong or right answer yet.
Indeed.
So it's ever changing, it's evolving. But in my opinion, like that siloed organization, getting a seat at the table is actually what's allowing organizations to move faster.
Indeed. So let me ask you this. So now that you say that we need to have a separate kind of a CEO, but the Chief Enablement Officer. Again, this is assuming that the organization is forward thinking, can actually take a look at all this and everything else as well, right? Now, isn't that just adding another silo to it? So you'll have marketing, sales, and then a CEO, like a sales enablement function?
I think it depends, right? Because I think the issue that we've just talked about is that sales wants to use the tool, but sales doesn't always have the operational efficiencies to manage it, or manage the platform, or make sure it's being used to its fullest extent. Marketing tends to want to use it for their own reasons, whether it's, content, but not get the buy-in. But when you have the enablement function owning something, they really care about end to end, in my opinion, a little bit more, right? They care about what content is being created and how it's actually being distributed, and if the marketing message is on brand. Mm-hmm. The sales and marketing team care about those things in their own silos, but I really do think that enablement is an overlay, whether it's its own division, it reports to marketing, reports to sales. I do think that it has a specific function that is more opposed to the greater good and isn't necessarily tied to the success of the organization and the metrics that sales and marketing are as tied to, which allows it to have a little bit more of a holistic or softer approach to business.
Indeed. And to be perfectly honest, I think once I had to give a talk, I actually don't even call it sales. I just call it commercial enablement, because at the end of the day, it's your commercial organization, which, depending upon the kind of organization that you work with, could include marketing, sales, and this new sales enablement organization. Or it could be whatever we're looking at, but the key is commercial, and you can also include services to it as well, right? So again, that is something that I would, and I want to sort of kind of conclude this question by this: what typical implementation issues do you see, apart from alignment, getting buy-in, and change management? What other implementation issues should an organization be aware of when they're actually doing the sales enablement exercise?
Yeah, I think it's organizational readiness. That's the first thing that jumps to my mind, right? You might be ready for a platform or a tool or for sales enablement, whether it's, again, methodology, technology, strategy, but do you have your house in order to get there, right? I think one of the first things that we start with is a content governance program. Like, how do you govern your content today? Where is it? I hear companies that have content that's 8 years outdated and they can't control it. They've lost it, right? And I think that there is a bit of I need to kind of get my house in order and do a lot of upfront work to kind of, mold this to what it needs to be. But once you kind of set it, it's not a set it and forget it, but it's definitely I need to get my house in order. I need to put this together, and then I can evaluate it 3, 6, 9, 12 months down the road to see its success. So I do personally think that enablement in general has a bit of an uplift, right? An initial work in the beginning, but does require continual check-ins to make sure you're doing it right. And I think that's the biggest thing. And like you talked about, like global large organizations, Showpad has a number of those. And as you can imagine, they are different from division to division to region, and just streamlining processes tends to be a bigger process than anyone would anticipate.
So fantastic. So essentially, this is something that I think is what you said is spot on in terms of implementation. So if I want to kind of wrap it up, the key again is, if you want to do this, be aware that you might want to create a new sales enablement function, which is much more empowered to actually make decisions. And you can go and link it back to what you said earlier, that if you need to do this, we should be ready as an organization and ready to change if needed. And it kind of that sort of leads me to that one final point, which is, do you at Showpad actually have a kind of a maturity model of sales enablement that you actually go a tick mark with a specific customer, and then based on how they score on it, provide different solutions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that we have one that's necessarily a scoring model or a scoring rubric. It does depend on the region. However, we definitely have a maturity model, right? We have a number of models that we say, hey, this is where your organization is at, and this is where you need to go, right? We talk about this crawl, walk, run component.
Yeah.
If you've already done sales enablement and you want to make a switch, you might be able to walk and run fairly quickly. If you start from the ground floor, it's a lot bigger of a process. And I think for us, we definitely look at organizational readiness. We look at the initiatives, and being that we have over 1,200, 1,300 customers with the acquisition, we look for best practices that we can take from customer A and implement them at customer B, right? Because we want our customers to be successful. That's part of what we do. So the learnings are a big component of that, in my opinion.
Okay. All right. So now we've talked a lot about what sales enablement is, what are the building blocks of it, again, and what are some success factors. Now let me talk about the success. You talked about success as being critical, right? So when would you know that a sales enablement project is successful? So what are the metrics that you typically use?
Yeah, I would say a lot of, look at this in different ways, right? One of the things that my team is leading on is an ROI calculator, right? Like, how can we build an ROI calculator in the pre-sales process, introduce it, and then evaluate it over the customer journey? Now, every organization defines this success differently. In the Showpad example, is it time to onboarding, right? I've worked with customers that have a massively complex product set, and their churn and turnover 70%. They can't keep people on board, and it's too hard for them to learn. So how can we decrease ramp time? Wow. How can we increase selling time? How can we save the amount of time that reps are actually doing their real job? And there's statistics out there that range from 60 to 70% of sellers' time is doing everything but selling. Yeah. Right? So how do we find those? I mean, one of a Fortune, I believe they're Fortune 15 company that ran an evaluation utilizing Showpad and said, how much time is Showpad allowing my reps to save per day? And it was like 2.5 hours a day. And they did that by all of their salaries and all of their employees. And that's a pretty big difference, right? And so the success can change and is different. But again, ramp time, onboarding times, value in selling. From the marketing perspective, marketing teams make content, and I hate to do this, but like kind of finger in the air, like this is what we think works, right? But if you don't actually see if it's been tied to business or how it's used, when you get a $50,000 budget for content, where are you going to allocate that? How do you know where to allocate that? And that's where, like, at least where Showpad comes into play to say, hey, this content's actually being used. You should continue to build things like that. Or this content's not being used, right? So at least in the Showpad situation, that's what works. Again, when it comes to methodologies, we even, introduced new sales methodology. I've been at organizations before that have released new sales methodology. And once that methodology is released, how does that change our average sales price or our total contract value or our days to close, right? Or how does introducing a solutions engineering organization that's been trained in that and enabled help that as well, right? Mm-hmm. So again, there's a lot of defined metrics out there, but in the Showpad world, that's what we really focus on.
Now, James, one of the things when we read anything about kind of sales enablement metrics, right? The idea is that they talk about it after it has been implemented, right? But you talked about crawl, walk, and then run. Mm-hmm. So should an organization, when they do sales enablement, actually change their metrics because that's one of the things we don't see a lot, right? Because the assumption is this is what we need to do, but it's impossible for you to say, okay, I'm going to be evaluating based on their running potential when actually they are still in early crawl stage as well. So what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that most organizations will have their higher level key success criteria on that run component, but you do have to chunk it out, right? Yeah. So for instance, a lot of that crawl stage is, does this do
Yeah.
X?
Yeah.
Does it do Y? It's more functional, right? It's feature function, check boxes. Can it do this? Does it do this? Right? And then the second phase is more like, okay, we've introduced this. It's a little bit more arbitrary, but is it helping? Where is it helping? How's it helping? And looking at that. And then you start rolling into real success criteria, which is, once it's been introduced, how much time are my reps saving, that type of component. And so I think you have your higher level overarching, but each subsection definitely has its own goals that you need to achieve.
Indeed, right? Because I think I'm assuming that what makes it a little bit more complicated as well is that it could also be depending upon where your salespeople are. I could be a fresh person. I could be a rookie out there. And yes, the organization is running, but I could be a rookie, and the rookie still has to go through a crawl, walk, and run. But of course, that time of crawling, I'm assuming that could also be a metric you could see, that the time to crawl also becomes shorter for onboarding. And that would also be a measure of overall success as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, excuse me, again, why, the learning and the coaching component is so critical in this whole play, like you asked earlier, right? Like getting people ready from day one so that they're contributing faster, right? So that time to value is a lot quicker and faster.
Let me touch upon something where you talked about the fact that one of the companies you did some research with came back and said their sales reps are saving around 2.5 hours a day. Now, how much of that is actually, yes, sure, it's about talking to the customers and stuff like that, but the metrics are mostly based on what you've actually achieved. So my question to you is, how important is it that sales enablement should fit in with your CRM strategy or your Salesforce automation? Because it could be that a lot of the things that you're talking about might actually help because of better integration with your Salesforce automation, which again goes back to why you said sales process alignment. What are your thoughts on that, man?
Yeah, I think it can be mission critical, right? We see so many organizations that have dumped so much money into their CRM. Yeah. And CRM is great, right? But it is a back of the house system that does a lot of tracking.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the front of the glass or helping someone in the sales process. That being said, sometimes CRM is being asked to be, again, that holy grail that I mentioned that doesn't exist, right? Yeah. It's asked to literally do everything. So, companies like Showpad need to be able to fit in that strategy and be a part of that, right? We like to say sometimes that the CRM or even a content system like Adobe or Salesforce, right, is kind of the back of the glass, and Showpad's the front of the glass. Yeah. So being able to do things in Showpad, for instance, like send meeting notes or send the deck that went out, get automatically tracked in the Salesforce, right? That get automatically logged, automatically pushed, Salesforce Dynamics, right, into that CRM, right? And that, for the end seller, is very beneficial because it saves them time to log, right? Yeah. For the organization, it streamlines into this massive investment that they've made, right? And it's an ecosystem that's all just playing together, for the end user.
So I have 3 more points related to this, and I think after that, I think we'll try to wrap it up. The first thing is, you talked about all this, and you talk about visit reports and stuff, right? Now, you acquired a company called VoiceFox, which I thought was very interesting, and the idea was to have meetings like these kind of recorded and stuff like that. But do you foresee a time in the future where it's not part of sales? Yeah, it is part of sales enablement, and the fact that I can do a visit report by having a voice file that gets integrated. Is that the reason why you're looking at VoiceFox as well?
Yeah. The VoiceFox acquisition was done for a number of reasons, and we're kind of calling that conversation, right? Yeah. And our conversation is that you and I are on this call, in this meeting right now. There's actually a Showpad bot that's recording this, transcribing this, pulling out the key terms, the key words that were used, right? So that from a training and coaching perspective, if my manager wanted to come down and see what I wanted to do, right, he could say, hey, James, I saw that you use this type of term a lot. This is aligned with the branding and messaging. It allows you to go back on messages that you had with your prospects. Like, the further view that we want to go on is being able to say, that you and I are in a sales conversation, and based off your tone or based off the words that you're using, we can actually accurately predict if you're going to buy our software or not, right? Or if you are giving us competitive landmines or not.
Yeah.
In my opinion, that's where sales enablement is really going, is this AI component, this deeper level that is really continuing to use data that allows us to analyze things that we aren't seeing on the surface value.
But actually, you answered my next question, because I was thinking about AI, but you answered two things. So the way I hear this is, yes, VoiceFox can make a manager take a look at what are the key things that you're saying. You can also have AI running in the background to see based on the keywords used, will it help? But I'm also thinking in pure nitty-gritty terms, the fact that you can do a translation speech to text automatically means that I don't have to spend as much time in writing up a visit report. Because I'm just thinking at the base level, it could save you time in writing up a report where I can just take chunks of that report and just paste it. If my Salesforce automation, that's pretty much what they're asking for. A higher level would be, I can coach my people based on this. And the ultimate level would be where we can have AI, which is pretty much doing a lot of analysis in the background and saying, what are the chances of winning as well?
Yep, and also giving us recommendations on things we should say, content we should share, things we should do in the sales process, really being that coach for us in that process.
Indeed. And now the other thing, which of course you said saving 2.5 hours, and I'm assuming that right now part of that ability to save the time is based on practice. So is that the reason why you also take a look at Showpad Coach, is because yes, I will get to 2.5 hours of savings, but I need to be practicing a lot more upfront. Is that why you have Showpad Coach as well?
I think that's a fair question. I think that the savings time usually comes from administrative tasks, right? It really does come from trying to find things, trying to edit things, searching, but prepping, right? So prepping is definitely on it.
Indeed, that's what I'm thinking, yeah.
So you're right. Yes, that is one of the components for sure, in terms of why we have Coach, to be able to make sure that message is regurgitated over and over again. You can also see what your peers are doing and how it's been scored as well. So if I'm pitching something a certain way and I want to go see how my colleague Susan is doing it, I can do that.
And do you also have AI going over that as well right now, saying, we do this and we can then make a connection to the sales successful ones who use so many hours in Showpad Coach. And then you can take a look at what are the people who have scored high, and then you could start making recommendations as well.
Yeah, that's where I think we really want to be able to go, is saying, okay, someone did all of their training and coaching. They've been onboarded. They've now been out in the field. They've been utilizing Showpad this much. They're actually over quota here, and be able to tie all of that together to be able to find that silver bullet that everybody's looking for.
Fantastic. It looks like, again, the unlimited amount of time that we have is not enough to even scratch the surface of all things sales enablement. So again, James, thank you so much for your time. And I hope that we get a chance to discuss more in detail about different topics when we get the chance.
Agreed. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
And thank you all for tuning in to this exciting session on sales enablement. And of course, this will be made available to you soon, and stay tuned for the next webinars. Thanks.